So that's our introduction to the return from the exile. We thought we've talked on a number of occasions about the exile and the taking of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians in 721, and then the taking of the southern kingdom by the Babylonians in the year 587. And now we're thinking about the return, particularly to the southern kingdom. We'll come back to the northern kingdom a bit later on, okay? But the return to the southern kingdom. And actually there are three groups of people who returned that we know about from Ezra and Nehemiah. The initial return when the temple was rebuilt, and that's a group who returned with a character called Zerubbabel, about 50 years after the 587 conquest of the south. So that group returned with Zerubbabel about 50 years after they'd been taken into exile in Babylon. And then sometime later in 458, 50,000 exiles came with Ezra. And that's the story that's told in the latter part of the book of Ezra and then in Nehemiah 8. And that's where the prayer that we did today, or modification of that prayer, comes from. And then a little bit after that, Nehemiah brought a party to Jerusalem in 445, and they began rebuilding the walls of the city. So the first group rebuilt the temple. The second was a larger group that came some decades later, and then the third group rebuilding the city wall. We're going to return to our friends at the Bible Project. The Bible Project has these short little videos, 10-minute videos on just about every section of the Bible, Old and New. So I highly recommend them. We recommend it to you. But we're going to look the first couple of minutes about Ezra and Nehemiah just to get a sense there.
The books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In most modern Bibles, these books are separate, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author. The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem, and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on three key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these three stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support. And then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the three parts. Let's back up and see how it fits together. So the story begins with a decree from Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he's moved by God to allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And the author says this fulfills a promise made by the prophet Jeremiah that the exiles would one day return to Jerusalem. Now, this fulfillment should trigger our hopes in the many other prophetic promises that exile was not the end of the story. We have hope for a future messianic king from the line of David. We have hope for a rebuilt temple where God's presence will dwell with his people. Hope for God's kingdom to come over all the nations and bring his blessing, just like he promised to Abraham. And so it's with all these hopes in mind that we read on into the story of Zerubbabel.
Except we're going to stop right there. Just hold that thought that when the exiles return, there were lots of hopes, lots of anticipation. The promises spoken about by the prophets were expected to come to fulfillment. So that's the mindset with which the people
his name
returned. And here's another picture which shows Zerubbabel and the prophets Haggai and Zechariah are active and prophesying at that time. And then the return with Ezra, the big group that comes with Ezra, and then the rebuilding of the city walls under Nehemiah. And up the top are the various rulers of the period. Ezra is important. You remember when we were looking at the book of Ruth, we were thinking about the significance of Ruth being a Moabite. One of the very powerful reasons for seeing Ruth as belonging to this return from exile period is that Ruth is a counterpoint to Ezra. Ezra is the book that clearly says, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, to the foreigners, or the people that you find in the land, or do not take their daughters for your sons. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them at any time, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land, and leave it to your children as an everlasting inheritance. So that very strong inner group focus amongst the returning Jews, that they are not to have anything to do with the people who were still living in the land, who were either not Jews or descendants of Jews that didn't leave and were regarded as kind of apostate, I suppose. So the rebuilding of the temple, these are two views of what it was imagined the temple would look like and where it was located. We have the western wall of the temple still standing today, but of course there's a Muslim holy site there now with a Muslim mosque on it. But that's a reconstruction of what it would have looked like at its height after the return. And of course, the story of Ezra is about the reading of the Torah. The scroll is unrolled, and Ezra reads the Torah. And there's a very interesting passage that talks about how he has put into the group, all the crowd comes in the rebuilt temple to hear the Torah being read. And he has these groups that are set out, these people that are set out amongst the large group of people. And every so often he stops and they have like small buzz groups, not in breakout rooms, but just where they're standing in the temple forecourt. And these men that have been designated by Ezra interpret the Torah to them. And it's believed that that's actually the beginning of the Pharisees. The Pharisees descend from this idea of having a scripture scholar in every location to be able to interpret for you the significance of the law. So that's one of the things that happened in the return from exile that flows on and becomes quite significant in New Testament period. We're going to think now about what was done with some of the documents at this period when the people of Israel, the Jewish people, returned to Israel, and particularly the leadership taken by the priests, not just in the temple, but also in the construction of their literature. So we're going to revisit this method called redaction criticism, which is looking at two Old Testament texts side by side and seeing how one might have redacted, modified, edited, changed the other.
If you look in your books on page 113, you'll find that, and 114, you'll find that there's three passages or three sets of passages. You've got 2 Samuel 8 and 1 Chronicles 18. And there is 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. And over the page, we have 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 15. So if I can ask you in your groups to just sit and look at what the main differences are between the two, because we know from this that the chronicler is using 2 Samuel as a source, but he's making some significant changes to it. So your job is to actually work out what those changes are. So room 1, if you can look at 2 Samuel 8 and 1 Chronicles 18. Room 2, you can look at 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. And then room 3, you've got 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 15. And that might look like a very long offering that you've got to get through, but there's particular things that you will find that are just not there in the chronicling episode. So it's not quite as difficult as you might think it is. So we're going to go into our breakout rooms. Is everyone clear about their task and what they're doing? So we're going to have a look at them on a case-by-case basis, and you can tell me what changes the chronicler has made and why you think they might have changed them. And you can also ask your questions. So here's the first one up for the first group. That was 2 Samuel 8, though some of the rest of you may have looked at it as well if you'd finished your particular passage. What are the changes that you have noticed?
We noticed in, well, there are 3 changes in Chronicle. The first one probably not as significant. Chronicle refers to David as he as opposed to David in verse 14. The second change was in verse 16 where the secretary's name's changed.
Yeah.
And the third change, which caused a great debate, was where in verse 18, Samuel referred and David's sons were priests, when in the Chronicles, David's sons were the chief officials in the service of the king.
Yes, you have nailed it. And that is the significant change.
Yes.
So the question is, what's going on? Why has the chronicler rewritten that?
Because David's sons weren't Levites. They weren't descendants of Aaron.
They weren't, but that's correct, Piers, but there's more behind it than just they weren't Levites.
What we were debating about was if the priests were writing chronicles, they wouldn't see David's sons as priests if they were not from the right class. And the chief officials in the service of the king, the debate was, is that a lowlier status than a priest, or it's a group that doesn't threaten the authority of the priests?
I think that the last phrase is right. It is a group that doesn't threaten the authority of the priest, and this is really important. You're onto something with that.
I think the other thing is that the priests were the rulers of the country by this stage.
Well, they certainly had a lot of influence.
It made me think of Donald Trump using Jared Kushner, was it? To be one of his diplomats, using his... Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments on that?
Could it have been an attempt to separate the power of state and religion?
It is, but not in the American or Australian sense. We talk about state and secular. You're all correct. Basically, the chronicler is a priest, and the priests do not want the king and his family usurping their authority as priests or butting their nose in to priestly things. So the chronicler makes it clear when he rewrites this account that being of the royal line does not grant you status as a priest.
Okay.
You can be a court official or a chief official. You can run the army. You can preside over the treasury or the cavalry or whatever, but not the rituals in the temple. Okay. So the chronicler is making that abundantly clear. No king's sons or anybody else from the royal line will be priests.
So the question, are the priests and the chief officials on the same status level, or the priest higher than the chief officials?
They're probably on the same status level, but they're presiding over different empires, if you like.
Yeah, right.
And if the king starts butting his nose into what the priests are doing, as far as the priests are concerned, this is a bad thing, because they want to do their own thing and control their empire, which is the temple rituals and the sacrifices and all that goes with that. And they don't need a meddling monarch either dipping into their treasury or nicking their goodies or, usurping what they see as their authority and their rights and their role as priests. So by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a very clear demarcation that wasn't there in the books in Samuel. Yes, was that you, Bruce? Yep.
Yes, my question is, why would they have bothered to do that if there was no king when Chronicles was written? In other words, they had it all to themselves. It just seems silly to write it so that the king doesn't have a role in their affairs, but there is no king when it was written. So
yeah, but there might be a king in the future. You're going to safeguard your position, you see, because the theory would be once Jerusalem was rebuilt and reestablished, you'd probably have some sort of ruler again. So we can't have anyone who's a descendant of David claiming they can also be a priest. Because if you've read the books of Samuel, you'd know that the earlier kings did have that function. They did make sacrifices. They did make petitions to God. They did receive oracles and things like that. We can't have that. That is just not on by the time of the chroniclers, where the priests are really claiming their power. Okay, so let's go to our second passage, which is 2 Samuel 24. And the chronicler again has changed that. This is much more interesting theologically, this one. So the group that had that, what have you got to say about that?
The first one was the Lord talking to David, and the second, the Chronicles had Satan talking to David.
Yeah. Now, let us be clear that capital S Satan shouldn't be there. It's that word Satan. It should be an enemy or an adversary stood up against Israel. So, let's banish that
Satan
translator's metaphysical capital out of that. And I'll ask you a question. Why would David be counting the people, i.e. the men of Israel? Why do kings count their blokes?
Tax.
Possibly. An army.
The army.
An army.
Yeah.
We know from the Old Testament that normally a census was conducted when there was going to be a war. So he knows how many able-bodied fighting men he's got. So the fact that he's counting the people suggests that there may be a war on the horizon. So to say an enemy stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel makes perfect sense.
Right.
In that context. But here, what is the shift we've got? We've shifted the blame from the Lord to an adversary. So we've got a movement of theology here. Instead of saying God was responsible for everything bad, the chronicler is saying an outside party or force is responsible for what then follows. And of course, David in verse 2 in the Chronicles and in verse 2 of Samuel says to the commanders of the army, take a census. So we know he thinks conflict's coming. But in 2 Samuel, the anger of the Lord is blamed and an adversary or an enemy is blamed in Chronicles. So what is the chronicler doing by doing that?
Keeping the Lord holy.
Keeping the Lord holy, that's right. He's keeping the Lord at a distance from any blame for what then happens. Because if you keep reading on from these verses, you'll find a plague comes. Because the Lord is rather fond of plagues. I've just been writing for With Love to the World, and I did Numbers 11, and there's so many fire and brimstone and plagues there that I said to Peter Butler, the editor, I said, I have no idea what I should be writing on this, and, I've done my best, but there's nothing good in this account.
And in the verse 3 there, Samuel just says, why does a king want to do this? While in verse 3, Chronicles says, why should he bring guilt on Israel? Why should he be guilty counting? That was our question.
Yes. So the chronicler's done two things to shift the anger off the Lord. The first is he's got an outside force, an adversary, an enemy. And the second is he points out that David doing that will bring the guilt on Israel, not the Lord. So it's been shifted. The blame for what follows is being shifted squarely onto David and the adversary or the enemy, whoever or whatever that actually is. So there's a shift in theology here. No longer is everything good and bad seen as coming from God. Bad is being shifted across to other people or forces or entities. So that's been a change between the writing of the books of Samuel and the writing of Chronicles. We're not going to blame the Lord for the crappy things that have happened. We're going to blame everything, other things, other people. Okay, now let's go to the really juicy one. Yes. 2 Samuel 6. and 1 Chronicles 15. And you'll find that the chronicler is a bit of a prude if you've read this through.
Yeah.
He is, yes.
Yeah.
What's he done? What's he changed?
Well, it gave David a linen robe to start with and covered up his nakedness.
That's right. We can't have a king being naked. That is not going to happen whatsoever. No, 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 no. No dangly bits for the chronicler.
Yeah.
He's going to put an actual gown on David. He's got a robe of fine linen. And who's he added in?
Well, it's marketing David as the king, not what he really was doing, prancing around and dancing and in his what? Ephod. We didn't know what an ephod was. We assumed it was undies.
It is kind of an undies. It's like a very short, loose. If you took an oblong of cloth and folded it in half and cut out a part for in the middle, like a scoop for a head to go through, and put it on someone, that is an ephod.
Oh, okay.
So it's open at the sides and it's very short, and it probably wouldn't cover David's dangly bits. So to all intents and purposes, he's naked wearing it because it'd fly up and. Yeah, and it's an undergarment that you wear under your linen robe.
And
it's not,
Michal was
and
very...
it's not, his loins aren't girded, as it were.
And Michal was quite upset about that. Like, so in Samuel, we hear her telling him off, rightly so, like, really going off at him for being, shamedly doing what he's doing and dancing. But in Chronicles, you hear nothing of that.
No, Michal is completely written out.
Yeah.
That doesn't appear. And you'll find the chronicler also completely writes out Bathsheba and that whole story there. He acknowledges she marries David at some point. He has to because she gives birth to Solomon. But the whole lead up to the story of David seducing her and her husband Uriah being killed, that's just completely missing in the Chronicles. So
and at the end,
we don't want to disgrace.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What was that, Kayleen?
Well, just at the end, the Chronicle names everyone and their positions, and they almost need a salary with it, but it's very specific.
Who's he naming? He's naming a specific group.
Levites.
It's the Levites. It's the priests. And you'll notice he adds the Levites in at other places. Verse 26, because God helped the Levites carry the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
So that's been added in. And at the end, he names all the Levites.
Oh, I haven't got to 26. Yeah,
so the sacrifice is quite different too. In Samuel, there's just an ox and a fatling, but in Chronicles, there's 7 of everything. And it's very priestly, isn't it, writing?
Yes, it is. And it's 7, of course, being a magical number. So 7 bulls and 7 rams. And the Levites are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, where it says in Samuel, when those who bore the Ark of the Covenant, he sacrificed the ox and fatling. So it is very precise. It's a magical number. David's got a nice dress on. Michal has been banished. And it does mention he'd had a linen ephod as well, but of course that would be under his robe of fine linen. And the other thing is David dancing in Chronicles?
Yes,
No.
Well, he is.
Well, yes, in 29.
In 29. It doesn't mention it where it mentions it in 2 Samuel, but it does say Michal looks out of the window. She sees David leaping and dancing and she's despised him. That's the only looking she's going to get. The whole argument between them is completely removed. So you can see the chronicler is a censor. Anything that may look bad on the Lord, anything that may reflect badly on King David has been sanitized. And you'll notice that in everything you read in Chronicles, the priests are inserted. So the Levites carry the ark here. The Levites are appointed as the minister of the Lord, and they're all named just to make sure everyone reading it is very clear about what the priestly duty is and their importance.
So he was predicting COVID, was he? Sanitizing everything.
Oh, that's a dead joke.
That is a bad joke, John.
Absolutely.
Well,
got to do better than that.
Any questions anyone has about this? This is a clear thing where you can see
Bruce
I know Bruce is there, John. This is a clear thing where you can see editing going on with the source. And we know it's editing because a lot of verses are just identical. They're just lifted straight from Samuel. Bruce, your question.
Now, leaving things out, you can still maintain the truth. It's just not a full disclosure. But in other cases where you're naming people as Levites, is that just a fabrication? Like so many people carried the ark, well, let's make them Levites? Or was it an omission in the earlier ones that they were Levites and that should be acknowledged?
No, I'd say it's a fabrication on the part of the chronicler. He's probably just inserted a bunch of Levites to make sure that the Levites are given that prominent duty, which involves looking after the ark.
Right.
Anyone may have carried it. When you read 1 and 2 Samuel and the ark is moving around, priests aren't carrying it. David just appoints people to carry it. So the Levite that's one of his additions.
So it's a falsehood.
Yes, in a sense, but remember what Midrash is, and we've talked about this, because the rabbis reinterpret and the writers of the Bible reinterpret things for their context. Now, they don't see it as a falsehood. They just see it as a legitimate way of making sure that the current context is reflected in Scripture.
Okay.
That's what they're doing. So it's not that the chronicler is deliberately lying through his teeth. The chronicler is reinterpreting what he sees the necessity of Scripture reflecting his current times.
Was he trying to newspapers?
Sorry?
A bit like early day newspapers.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well,
So
didn't the Levites carry the ark when they were fleeing from Egypt after it had been?
Yes, that's stated in Numbers.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the
but of course that
chroniclers
was written after the exile anyway, wasn't it?
That's right.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's another priestly contribution to something that probably wasn't quite historically accurate. And remember, these people do not view history as we do. They do not see history as a factual record of exactly what happened. They see history as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to make sure that the context is reflected in a way that makes sense to what's going on with the people at that time. That's what history is. And you tell it in stories. So we've got to get over our hang up that history is a factual account, not to these ancient writers. History is, if it didn't happen, but they think it should have happened, they'll put it in.
Just a quick question. That last bit, was that written to legitimize the role of the Levites?
Yes. Everything in these things is about legitimizing the role of someone, whether it's a king or whether it's Levites or whether it's charioteers on horses, who cares? I mean, people legitimate stuff and they delegitimate stuff. And the next thing we're going to look at is a delegitimation of one of the most famous kings of Israel.
Okay.
And because between the southern and northern kingdoms, there's issues. So the first question I'm going to ask you is to think about, what does it mean if you are blessed by the Lord in the Old Testament? What sort of things would you expect to see someone blessed by the Lord in the Old Testament?
Lots of children, lots of wives,
So you'd have children and wives,
cattle.
You'd have lots of livestock. Yep.
Wealthy. Victory over your enemies.
Yes, you'd be victory over your enemies. What was that, Jock?
Wealthy.
You'd be wealthy.
Live a long time.
You'd have a decent life, yes, a long life, which is not very long in the ancient world, really.
And people would probably respect you and come to you for advice and stuff.
People would respect you, come to you advice. Might you have a large house or castle?
Oh, yes.
With a wall around it?
Tent.
Yeah.
Yep, you probably would. Anything else? I think you've covered most of the things, especially when it comes to the kings of Israel. You would expect them to have armies, a castle or a large house. It would be walled and protected. They would have a lot of wealth. They would have respect from, you know, foreign dignitaries and other countries around them. They would be blessed with sons. They would have a decent reign, a reasonably long life. People would seek them out, all of those things. I mean, you know, when I said think about Solomon, there are all the things that Solomon received as a king. Now we're going to look at Omri. Who's heard of Omri?
Right.
Okay.
You have. Here he is, Omri, king of Israel. In the 27th year of King Asa of Judah, the southern kingdom, Zimri reigned 7 days in Tirzah, and the troops were there. And it's going to tell you there was a civil war, basically. Zimri has conspired and he has killed the king, and all Israel, that's the northern kingdom, made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. So that's how Omri gets there. So the writer is telling you that there was a coup and Omri is placed on the throne. And so Omri goes up with all of Israel, besieges Tirzah, and he wins. So blessing 1, Omri, winning. It's important. Zimri saw the cities taken. He goes into the citadel, then he burns down the king's house over himself with fire and died, as you do. And then, because of the sins that he committed, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam, and we can't have that, can we? And for the sin that he committed, causing Israel to sin. That's why he died in fire. Now, the rest of the acts of Zimri, etc., are they not written in the book of annals of the kings of Israel? Now, we don't have this source. We know it existed from this reference, but it is not an extant source, okay? And then the people of Israel were divided into 2 parts. So we're going to have a civil war. Some followed Tibni and made him king, and half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri overcame the people who followed Tibni, and Tibni died and Omri became king. So Omri wins again, and he's made king. So 3 blessings. And in the 31st year of King Asa of Judah, southern kingdom, Omri reigns over Israel. He reigns for 12 years. 6 of them in Tirzah. That's not a bad reign in the ancient world, where some kings' reigns ended very abruptly when they were assassinated by people. Now, what does Omri do? He buys the hill of Samaria. This is going to give you a clue why he's spoken about the way he is. He buys it, he fortifies it. So he builds a city, he puts a wall around it. That's what fortify means. And it's called Samaria after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. So, blessings. He's got a fortified city and he's got wealth to be able to buy it and build it. And then what happens? Omri does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil than all who were before him, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, blah, 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 and the sins he committed. Now, the rest of the acts of Omri, they are again in the book of annals in the kings of Israel, which we've lost. And Omri goes to sleep with his ancestors. He's buried in Samaria, and his son Ahab succeeded him. So Omri has sons. Omri has an army. Omri wins against his enemy. Omri has a fortified city with a big house and a castle in it. He reigns for 12 years and his sons inherit. Is Omri blessed?
Yeah.
Yes, he is. By Old Testament standards, he certainly is blessed. Now, is this writer about Omri inferring Omri is blessed?
No.
No. Why might that be? Who's writing it, do you think?
Southern Kingdom.
Southern Kingdom.
Southern Kingdom writer, bang on the money. It's written by someone from the Southern Kingdom. And the Southern Kingdom don't like the Northern Kingdom. Why is that?
Were they stronger?
No, not necessarily. There's more theological reasons. Jen?
Well,
they cut themselves off from Jerusalem and the temple.
Yes, they did. They worship differently. When they divided the United Kingdom, before it and after it, they had their own sort of high altars in the mountains. Jen, what were you trying to say?
They broke away from the United Kingdom. They were broke away.
They separated out again. Yep. So they're separate. They're not worshipping in the same way. What else are they doing? Or what else are they going to establish?
A separate kingdom.
Yes, but there's something about this kingdom. And there's a word starting with S that appeared at least 3 times. And Jews don't like them.
Samaria.
Samaria, yes. The northern kingdom is going to morph into Samaria and nothing good comes out of Samaria. So even though Omri has all the trappings of blessing, he's not actually accorded any of that fame and that blessing from this southern kingdom writer because, gasp, he established the dreaded, horrid, hated Samaria. So let's have a look at page 115 in your book. And we'll see how
Elizabeth?
Yes, you rang.
How long has that hatred of Samaria been? I would have thought it came about from this episode.
We're going to do Samaritans in a little bit. I've got another passage, another juicy passage for us to look at, which may answer.
We'll do that.
Okay.
There's all sorts of reasons. There's religious and theological reasons, and also the Northern Kingdom refused to divorce their foreign wives. So anyway, but John will talk more about that. Let's have a look at page 115. And we have here the king of Moab and a Moabite inscription. It's held in the Louvre, and there's a little picture of it there, which you won't be able to read. But underneath it, you will see that a translation of there. Omri was king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days because Chemos is the god of the Moabites, was angry with the land. His son succeeded him and said, behold, I too will afflict Moab. So Omri afflicted Moab, and Omri's son afflicted Moab. And it says Omri had taken possession of the whole of the land. And he dwelt there during his days and during a portion of his son's days. But then, of course, there was another war, and Chemos, god of the Moabites, has obviously restored part of it to the king of Moab. So you can see there that Omri is, what do you call it? Omri is seeking, tribute or tax from Moab for many days. And his son succeeded him, so we can probably say that's for many years. So we know from this inscription that Omri was quite a successful general, as well as a king. And he managed to tribute, that's the word I'm looking for, and managed to extract tribute from Moab, we know that, and win that war. On page 117, there's been a number of important sites that have been excavated in the northern half of Israel, which that was the Northern Kingdom. And you can see there that Megiddo, Hazar, Samaria, Tel Dan have all been excavated quite extensively. And so there's information that's been gleaned there about Samaria's construction by Omri and the Omride dynasty, which provides us with lots of references to Israelite ethnicity. And we find that in a lot of extra biblical monuments that the kingdom of Israel was referred to the land of Omri. For actually, oh, John. You can see how successful Omri is there.
We've actually got a picture of Omri from his time, you see.
That's right, the brick Bible it's called. So many Assyrian monuments, and Assyria was eventually the party that destroyed the Northern Kingdom, but many Assyrian monuments laud Omri's military exploits. They tell of his establishment of Samaria, that he had a vast fortress city that became the capital of the northern tribes. And because he had a line of powerful successors, a dynasty was established. The kingdom of Israel was referred to as the land of Omri for over a century.
Mm.
So, other evidence we have in regard to Omri and his dynasty, John has up there now, and it attests to tribute that was given them by Ahab of Israel, one of the descendants of Omri. His reign there's a bit of controversy about it, and he's meant to have had 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers, likely an exaggeration, but it does stress that he's a powerful and wealthy king and general. So there's no mention of this battle in Kings or Chronicles. We don't know anything about it. And probably they've just left it out if Jehu was shown to be defeated in this battle and having to pay tribute to the Assyrians. Well, we're not going to mention that, so it's just dropped out of the record. So Samaria was called in the Assyrian records the house of Omri, and Israel was called the land of Omri for well over a century. So again, blessing-wise, how's Omri faring?
Pretty well.
Pretty well, isn't he? That's right. So this little bit is just to show you, you might think this is again about what we consider history in our Bible. You might read it and think, oh, well, that's a fact. Well, not necessarily, because the ancient writers wrote not only with their context in mind, they had political axes to grind. And the way Omri is treated by the Southern Kingdom writers is a really, really good example of a political axe being ground. We don't like the Northern Kingdom because they're Samaritans, they married foreign wives, they worship in high places, and they're all doing evil in the sight of the Lord anyway. So we're going to trash them and say that, you know, we'll give Omri 15 verses. We won't talk about all his successes. We'll refer to this lost book. Well, it wasn't lost in those days. We'll just refer to this book and we'll bury him with his forefathers, and that'll be that. Now, if the Northern Kingdom was telling this story, do you think it would read like that? Probably not. It would be quite different. So this is just a little exercise to show that the biblical writers aren't necessarily historically accurate. They're not necessarily inspired by God, whatever that means. They will write stuff out of their political context. So
and we're going to continue that by looking at another story about the Northern Kingdom.
Is there any questions first about Omri before we move to the Samaritans?
Sure.
If people are puzzled. Do you all understand the point I'm making? You just can't take it at face value. You've got to actually understand the context in which these things were composed and why they were written the way they are. And people didn't think it was lying. It's called propaganda. What you're reading. Okay, take it away, John.
Another story of propaganda. Now, this is from a century after the time of Omri. And you'll find this in 2 Kings 17. In the 12th year of King Ahaz, Hoshea began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years. He, of course, being a northern king, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against him. Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute. The king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, confined him and imprisoned him. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. So that's in our terms, that's 724 to 721. He captured Samaria in 721. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So it's very specific. So this is the northern kingdom being taken into exile by the king of Assyria. This occurred, says the writer of 2 Kings 17, a southerner, this occurred because the people of Israel up there in the north had sinned against the Lord their God. They had worshipped other gods. They had walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. So they followed the traditional religious practices of the people who were in the land before they had settled in the land centuries before. And also those evil kings of Israel had introduced bad practices. They secretly did things that were not right. They built high places from watchtower to fortified city. They set up pillars and sacred poles on every high hill. You notice you go into a country town and the church is always on the highest point in the town overlooked. Well, that's not our idea. That's a very ancient idea, that the high places are the holy places. So the sacred pillars, pillars and sacred poles are on the high hills and under every green tree. And they made offerings on the high places. These are to pagan gods, says the southern writer. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served the idols of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. So the king of Assyria then brings people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, all of these places in the Fertile Crescent, and brings those people and plants them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. So he'd taken the Israelites in the region of Samaria, taken them away to Assyria, and then had brought Babylonians, Cuthites, etc., and planted them in the place. When they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. This was in Israel, in the northern kingdom. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. He's a nice guy. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there. So this is one of the northern kingdom Israelite Yahweh worshipping priests. Let that priest go and live there and teach them the law of the God of the land. Because according to the king of Assyria, the God of the land was Yahweh, was the Israelite God. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came back, lived in Bethel, and taught them how they should worship the Lord. So this is the southern explanation about what went on in the northern kingdom. The people were taken away. Then God got upset. So a priest of Yahweh is brought to teach the people how to practice the religion that Moses had first taught them. But they kept on making gods of their own. They put them in the kinds of high places. They worshipped the Lord alongside that. So they worshipped the Lord, but served their own gods after the manner of the nations they've been carried away. So we've got a priest of the northern kingdom in the northern kingdom teaching these foreigners brought from elsewhere how to worship Yahweh, but they, of course, had brought their own gods and they were worshipping them as well. Now, this is the crucial line. To this day, they continue to practice their former customs. This is written with knowledge that there are people living in the former northern kingdom, the region called now Samaria. They claim to be worshipping God, but also worshipping other gods, not Yahweh, not the Lord. They, says the southerner, do not worship the Lord. They do not follow the statutes, ordinances, or law or commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob. So these nations worship the Lord, but also serve their carved images. To this day, their children and their children's children continue to do as their ancestors did. This is the southern explanation in 2 Kings 17 about what is wrong with the Samaritans. So not only Omri and his family did evil in the sight of the Lord, but when the king of Assyria took a whole lot of northerners away and brought foreigners to live there, they were taught allegedly how to follow God, how to follow the commandments, but they still worshipped their own gods. So they were doing evil in the sight of the southerners. Those people, of course, are the Samaritans. Now you can see there on the map, the region of Samaria. Those pictures are pictures that I've found of modern day Samaritans. So there is still a group, a very small group and a very inbred group of Samaritans that exist today, and they still practice animal sacrifice. So the top right-hand corner is one of their priests, and in the bottom left-hand corner, an older photo is of a group of Samaritans. They had a temple on Gerizim. There's been an archaeological investigation, and this is the remains of the temple that have been exposed by the archaeological digs. So there was a temple, you can see it's a square temple on Mount Gerizim. This is on page 118 of your book. You will find a number of references to the temple at Gerizim. They go right back into Deuteronomy 11:28, Mount Gerizim is mentioned. Joshua 8 mentions Mount Gerizim. Of course, in John, when Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman, "Sir," she says, "I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. She's referring to this temple when it was, of course, it was in ruins by the 1st century. But that was the holy place for the northerners, for the Samaritans. Josephus refers to the Samaritans. You can see there in his book on the Jewish antiquities in book 12, their temple was the holy one. Those from Jerusalem said their temple was the holy one and required that the sacrifices be sent there. But the Shechemites, those from the region of Shechem in the north, wanted these to go to Mount Gerizim. And then there is the infamous episode that he reports in the 1st century, in book 18 of the Jewish Antiquities, when the festival of unleavened bread, the Passover, was going on. The priests were accustomed to throw open the gates of the temple after midnight. This time, when the gates were first opened, some Samaritans who had secretly entered Jerusalem began to scatter human bones in the porticos and throughout the temple. That would render the whole of the temple unclean, unholy. So the priests excluded everyone from the temple, and they blamed it all on those terrible Samaritans. So Josephus, of course, is a southerner, writing at the end of the 1st century, after the time of Jesus. So we've got a number of southern references to the northerners, the Samaritans. Now, the interesting thing is that the Samaritans still exist today, and there is ancient Samaritan literature that's in existence. It's written in a version of Hebrew, like the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. It's a different kind of dialect of Hebrew. I don't pretend to understand anything at all about that. But what I do know is one of the world experts on the Samaritan literature. He's now retired, but for many years he taught at Sydney University, and that's Professor Alan Crown. And he's published a lot about Samaritan literature. So we actually have things from their point of view, as well as the southern criticism of them that we have in the Bible, in Josephus. So on the bottom of page 118, there's another text, and this comes from a document called Moled Moshe, which is a story about Moses from the Samaritan point of view. So the Samaritans say, we are the keepers of the tradition. We adhere to the law of Moses. We had our own temple. We make sacrifices to Yahweh at that temple. And Moses is a very important figure for us because he is the one who gave the law. Just as for the Jews in the south, the Judeans, Moses is important. So also for the Samaritans, they claim the same heritage. And look at how they describe Moses, and this might resonate with you with some other biblical texts. The great prophet Moses was born, good is the mention of him. God said to the host of heaven, he is born for whom I created my world, for whose sake I created it out of nothing. My good pleasure is in him who surpasses all, mightiest of every female and male, highest of all creatures hitherto created or to be created hereafter. The galaxies were in exceeding great joy, and all of them did obeisance to him, for his light was the origin of theirs. The house of Amram were dwelling in light, and the fullness of light was directed on him. Moses is the light of the world for the Samaritans. Everyone was saying, the prophet of the Lord is born, in whom is his favor. The select of all creation is born. The man of God is born. He that is trusted over all his house. The servant of the Lord is born, and his inheritance. The one chosen out of all his prophets is born. The prophet of the world and of its end is born. So there's resonances here about Moses, and there's also resonances about how the New Testament portrays the birth of Jesus, with the angels singing glory to God in the sky, and then John writing in his gospel about the central importance of the word, and the word brings light to the world, etc., etc. So you've got a whole cluster of religious motifs. Now, for the Samaritans, that's their faith, that's their belief. They believe they are being true to Moses, and they have the covenant of Moses, the covenant with Noah, the covenant of Abraham, a whole lot of covenants that they adhere to. They have 5 books of the Bible, which of course makes a course on books of the Bible for the Samaritans much shorter than it does for us Christians, because we have 6 books of the Bible. But they have 5: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. and a different version, a different kind of dialect of those books. And then they have their own sacred literature, like the Jews have other sacred literature. So the Samaritans, we have a very jaundiced and biased view of the Samaritans from the Old Testament and from the New Testament. What is really interesting for us is to think about the story of Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman in John's Gospel, that the people of that woman's town are the first to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They see him as Moses come back. And then presumably they spread the news. In the book of Acts, there's the story of Philip going to Samaria and preaching, and they respond positively. And of course, in Luke's Gospel, there's one of the most famous of all of Jesus' parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Jesus' attitude towards the Samaritans transcends that terrible enmity and hatred that had developed over many centuries. He apparently appears to see them as somehow or other brothers and sisters, in contradiction to the story we're told in 2 Kings 17, and the way in which Omri and other kings of the north are seen. So really interesting coming together of a number of different texts in when we think about the Samaritans. Okay, is that all okay? Any questions about Samaritans? Bruce?
The impression you've given me is that the Samaritans were now, a different ethnic mix than the original Northern Kingdom. That the entire of the Northern Kingdom had virtually been taken away. Now, in the Southern Kingdom, you said that it was more the wealthy and educated people who were taken away, and the rest of society was remained behind. After they came back, did many northern people come back to Samaria, or did it remain, largely an area of foreigners?
Well, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that.
Like with our society, we have people who have come and gone, but we're essentially an Anglo-Saxon community, in terms of custom and number.
Yeah, well, you see, the thing with the Southerners returning, there were people that still lived in the Southern Kingdom, the former Southern Kingdom. The people that came from Babylon, some of them had already married, so a number had married Babylonians. So many of them would have stayed in Babylon. That's of the dispersion. Now, how many of those that came back with Babylonian wives or husbands? We don't know. And how many of them came back with a changed language? We do know, because Aramaic is the language that developed out of the combination of Hebrew and Babylonian in the exile. So the language that Jesus speaks is not pure Jewish in the sense that it's had, not that any language is pure, in the sense that it's had influence from Babylonia, Aramaic. Now, to what extent are there customs that have been brought from Babylonia into the Southern Kingdom? I think there's evidence for a number of those customs coming in. So neither the North nor the South were pure, despite what their propaganda might tell you.
That's exactly right. We know from Ezra and Nehemiah that they married foreign wives in the South.
It's exactly because they were doing that.
Yep.
And then they came and married people that had remained in the land. Yeah. So we've got, we might have propaganda literature that tells us about the purity of stuff, but the reality on the ground is different.
Didn't more Jews just stay in Babylon than actually come back to Jerusalem? Wasn't it the largest Jewish society?
Yep. So those that left, both to Assyria and to Babylon, the majority of them stayed, and also they started spreading into other places. So this map, which I think I've shown you before, and it's on page 119, indicates the spread of Jewish settlement. The purple is by the 1st century of the Common Era. The blue is by late Roman period, and then even possibly later up into France and Britain. So, and right until this day, there are far more Jews living outside of Israel and Samaria and Judea than there are in those lands. Yeah, so the dispersion becomes the dominant form of Judaism, despite what's going on back in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to ask if there was 2 stories of exile. One was from the north and one was from the south, or it was just one?
Yes. No.
Story.
Two different stories. The story in 2 Kings 17 is in the year 721. That's the northern kingdom. And then later on, the year 587, that's the end of the book of Kings. Can't remember which chapter, 24 or 25. The latter part is when the Babylonians, like 140 years later, the Babylonians down south are taking Jews from there into exile. So there were 2 major exiles, Chop. Yeah.
Thank you. Was there 2 places they were taken to exile, or just one place, Babylon?
Well, there are many places. The Assyrians took them largely to up northern part to the Syria. The Babylonians took to Babylon and further down to the south, between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates.
To be slaves?
I suppose initially, but to be productive workers in society. Yes. Yeah. The other thing to note about this period of time is the rise of apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic literature, there are many examples, and this is on page 122 of your book. There are many examples from about 200 before the Common Era. Remember the video that we started with said that when the people returned to Jerusalem, they came with great hopes that all kinds of promises of the prophets would be fulfilled. But over time, it became clear that those promises weren't being fulfilled. Imagine what life was like, first of all, in exile, and then when you returned from Babylon, you brought brilliant hopes, but there were bleak realities staring you in your face. So how do you hold together the reality that you're experiencing and your hopes? What is the vision for what you expect life to become like, what you want life to be like? How is this going to come about? There are questions on page 120. Have time to look at that, Elizabeth?
Yes.
We will think a little bit about what does it mean to be Jewish but not able to live in Jerusalem? What does it mean to be Christian and not have a church building? This is a very pertinent question given what we've experienced over the last year. Holding on to faith when you can't gather together in the building. What is it even more so? How do you hold on to faith when you're in exile or when you come back and find your holy site in ruins?
Okay, I'm going to open runes now for your discussion.
Okay, going to do a little bit to finish off about apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, of course, is well known to us from the book of Revelation, the last book of Christian scripture. But there are lots of Jewish examples. Apocalyptic comes from the Greek word apocalypsis meaning unveiling or revealing. So an apocalyptic writing is a revealing of the promise that God has, so it's believed, for the future, the new heaven, the kingdom of God, what God is intending to bring about. So there are some apocalyptic passages in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Zechariah. So apocalyptic emerges out of prophetic stuff and may even be predating the return from exile, but certainly after the return from exile and the frustration and dashing of hopes leads people to write to have these visions and to write about these visions that they're having about what God will surely do. The book of Daniel, for instance, is believed to have been written in the 2nd century. That was when, at that stage, Jerusalem was under the control of a group called the Seleucids, which were descendants from Alexander the Great from Macedonia. And a ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes actually had the temple desecrated by erecting a statue of Zeus in the middle of the temple. That was in the year 167. And that is what led to the Maccabean uprising. And the Maccabees were celebrated as holy men, warriors actually, in Jewish traditions. So the story of Daniel is really about that time, so it is believed, even though it is allegedly set 4 centuries earlier during the Babylonian captivity, telling about how Daniel receives revelatory visions during that time of exile. It's really about offering hope to the Jews when they are oppressed and under, and their temple has been desecrated. There are a whole lot of other books written by Jews. One book attributed to Enoch, which is actually 5 different sections. The Book of Jubilees, some oracles of the Sibyl, who was actually a pagan goddess, but or a pagan figure, but taken over by the Jews and claimed that she was making oracles that are very Jewish in their nature. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, those the last things written by the 12 sons of Israel, Jacob allegedly dug up and found centuries later on. The Psalms of Solomon, the Testament of Moses, the martyrdom of Isaiah, and a whole lot of Dead Sea Scroll books and others. So there's heaps and heaps of apocalyptic literature, not much of which is found in the Old Testament, and only when it continues on into Christian literature, the book of Revelation is one example. So this is an expression of the yearning and hope of people for God to act. And of course, Jesus picks up on that with his whole speech about parables about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. All right, we're coming almost to the end of our course. We have a session next week, and I'll be sending an email out to you either tonight or tomorrow. These questions will be in the email, but part of what we would like to talk about together is for you to review the whole of this course and think about these questions. What parts of the Old Testament have surprised you in what we've done? What are the parts that are really helpful for your faith, for the way you understand your Christian faith and for the way you live your Christian faith? What are the things that we've done, the things that we've found that confronts you or leaves you with questions or doubt? And also, to be honest, what actually seems irrelevant to me as a Christian disciple in the 21st century, having looked at all sorts of passages in the Old Testament. So I'll put them in an email and send them to you, and we'll talk about that. Also in the email will be Elizabeth's sermon, which we'll spend some time thinking about. So if you can read that sermon before next week, then we'll talk about what's going on. How is the Old Testament being preached in that sermon? What kind of model does it provide? And finally, on page 124 in the book, there's 2 sections from the basis of union. And we may, if we have time, think a little bit about that as the concluding part of next week's session. So what we're going to try and do next week is think about preaching from the Old Testament, what we've discovered that may be helpful or that raises issues for you. Look at an example of preaching from the Old Testament, and then think about Scripture as a whole in terms of what the Uniting Church Basis of Union says. So that's the plan for next week, to try and bring everything to a kind of integrated conclusion. And I think Rowan will be sending you out also after next week's session an opportunity for you to fill out an evaluation form And we really appreciated the people in the New Testament course that filled out evaluations, and we don't get to see, it comes to us completely anonymized. So you can say whatever you like and it won't be held against you personally. But that's a really important part of the learning process and teaching process. I think
John?
Yes.
We are electing new elders, so that we're looking at the document regarding eldership in the Uniting Church, and they're starting up a new website for the Uniting Church. And the interesting thing is they haven't put the current current document in there. There's a 1986 one, but there's a much more recent one. They've put the 1986 one in. I don't know whether you've got anything to do with that site.
No, I don't.
It seems a bit peculiar that they're putting the old site into archiving it.
Yeah.
And they've put an archived copy of the document.
Yeah. Patricia, can you send me the link to that document, or send me the document, and I'll send it on to. I mean, I know some of the people that work in the assembly. Send it on and suggest to them that they actually put it up.
I'll do my best.
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
What about?
Sorry, Bruce. Yep.
When do we get the bonus session, eco-theology in the Old Testament?
Well, we hadn't planned to put it in because it seemed to extend it, but if you really want it, we could manage it.
Oh, it'd be wonderful.
Could we?
And we can ask if Jason John would like to pop in, because he does that very well. If there's enough people interested, we could do that.
I'll be very interested in that, yeah.
Well, we could still do it on the following Thursday, I guess.
Yeah.
It'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Well, we can confirm that next week, and we'll see if Jason's available. If he's not, John and I can run that. Lectionary Cafe will follow after this, so if you're not staying for that, I'll ask you to depart. Before you depart, Peter Howe, can I talk to you?
Yes.
Are you in John Barilaro's electorate?
State, yeah.
Yes. Uniting are looking for people in Barilaro's electorate to actually be part of a Zoom delegation to meet with him about their campaign to get illegal drug use decriminalised.
Okay.
They asked me to be part of it, but I'm in the ACT. I'm actually in David Smith's federal electorate, and I'm in the ACT government's local electorate. And I thought of you. I don't know what you think of Uniting's move to do that, but if you're in favour of it, would you be interested in talking to Barilaro?
I would, but there's somebody who would do it better than I would. Somebody who's really passionate about.
Can you email me with their details, please?
Yes, I will.
If you don't mind. And if you don't mind, I'll pass both your details on to Uniting.
Okay.
Okay, that would be great. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Elizabeth, can I just say, I'd like to say goodbye to everyone. I'm about to go away for 2 weeks to the Kimberleys, and I'm not sure what our reception won't be great, and I'll be travelling on the Thursday. So I will pick up what has been said afterwards by the recorded message, but I've thoroughly enjoyed the course.
Oh, thanks very much, Mary. I mean, Bill and Jenny are still managing to tune in, but they haven't hit the Kimberleys yet. I don't know what it'll be like when they get there.
Well, certainly, I'm not sure where some of the places we'll be staying, where I'll be at, what the reception will be like.
That's fine. All right. Well, thanks for being part of the course, Mary. It's been good to have you with us. And we'll see you if there's other things we're running. Of course, I'll see you at Tauranol.
You will. Thank you very much.
Yep. Bruce.
Hi, Mary.
Just a quick question.
Yep.
I've got a couple of family commitments in the fortnight coming up, and I was wondering whether the submission of the work papers for assessment was a hard 4-week deadline, or whether it's
no, it's not, Bruce.
Well, that's good.
It's fine.